Afternoon, everyone. My name is Nasra Ismail. Thank you so much. I am the U.S. Executive Director for Alight. I'm extremely proud to be here and to welcome all of you to this discussion on forced displacement. You found, hopefully, the right room. But if not, please stay. We have an incredible, distinguished colleagues who are going to be talking to us about this topic. I thought I would frame this discussion, but because we're a little bit behind, I think actually you have all the framing you will need in the experts that I will introduce. So I'm actually going to introduce and welcome our keynote speaker, Rez Gardi. Forgive me, I'm going to read her bio because it deserves to be read. It's in your packet. I hope you can have some time with her in the Q&A and after. But let me tell you who is opening this event for us. Rez Gardi is an international lawyer and human rights advocate. Born as a refugee in Pakistan, Rez sought to use her difficult start in life as a motivation to help others. She became New Zealand's first female Kurdish lawyer and the first Kurd to graduate from Harvard Law School. I think that deserves a round of applause. Her previous role includes work from the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, lecturer on international law and human rights, and Harvard Human Rights Fellow in Iraq, working to build cases for the prosecution of ISIS regarding their targeted genocidal campaign against the Yazidis. Rez is a founder of Empower, a refugee-led organization that aims to address the underrepresentation of refugee youth in higher education. She is also the co-founder of the Center for Asia-Pacific Refugee Studies at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. And there's at least 2 other paragraphs that I could read, but I cannot wait for you to hear from her personal experience, her professional experience on this topic. And then following that, we'll have other colleagues, other experts in a panel discussion to further discuss. And if we're lucky, and I think we are, we'll also have a Q&A for about 10 minutes. That's how the hour is gonna go. I'm delighted to welcome Rez to the stage.
Roj Bash, Hamu Bkher Hatin Serchava, Ena Mana, Ena Reo, Ena Fenua, Oteao, Norera, Tena Koto Katoa. I greet you firstly in my native mother tongue, Kurdish, and then in Te Reo Māori, the language of the Tangata Whenua, indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I was fortunate to be given a home free from persecution. Before I begin, as a guest here, I want to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongava people. I honor and pay respect to their ancestors and elders, past and present and emerging. My name is Rez Gardi. I'm a former refugee. My family was forced to flee due to the genocidal campaign against our ethnic minority, the Kurdish people in our homeland. I was born stateless and as a refugee in Pakistan, where my family spent almost a decade before being resettled. Then one day they told us, you're going to New Zealand, this city in Australia. Takes a moment. So our family was resettled to New Zealand under the resettlement program. Growing up in a refugee camp, I didn't know the possibilities that extended beyond our tent city. Our dreams were confined in the same way as the borders of our camp were secured by barbed wires. We had to flee due to the fear of persecution, the fear of being killed for simply who we were and trying to exist. But now we were caged in because we were feared. I learned about the denial of human rights and the lack of justice before I knew what those concepts meant legally. As refugees, the circumstances we are born into are shaped by powers beyond our reach, yet we are the ones that live the consequences of persecution and displacement. In Pakistan, I was denied an education because of my refugee status. At some point, I was once a refugee with dreams of higher education, and now I stand before you as a lawyer. To me, it was not just about studying law. It was about all the barriers, the stereotypes, and the assumptions that I wanted to crush, to prove that we, as refugees, could dream bigger than the constraints of our identities and experiences allowed. It was about taking back control of our lives, and one day, hopefully being able to influence the laws that apply to people who are forcibly displaced as I once was. While there are many experts, academics, practitioners, and lawyers like me who also happen to have lived experience of forced displacement, refugee voices are still largely missing in the design and decision-making of policies and programming that impact us directly. With climate change on the rise and conflicts becoming increasingly protracted, the global refugee regime is at a crossroads. We find ourselves in a system where power is concentrated into the hands of a few, and the rights of those that are most marginalized are regularly violated. Refugee situations continue to increase in scope, in scale, and complexity. The current refugee crisis is the worst the world has ever seen. Across the globe, over 100 million people have been forcibly displaced through persecution, conflict, and other human rights violations. Forcibly displaced persons now constitute about 1% of the world's population. Adding the accelerating climate crisis to the equation, that proportion is expected to grow close to 15% by 2050, with the number of displaced individuals potentially topping 1 billion. Every year, natural disasters alone displace an average of 26 million people. That's one person every second. The global refugee regime is fragmented and underperforming, and it is largely reactionary. As the number of displaced people continues to grow, effective solutions are becoming increasingly scarce. When my family was resettled, we were amongst the fortunate 1% of refugees globally to receive such an opportunity. Today, those numbers have plummeted to 0.01%, and families now wait an average of over 20 years for resettlement, if ever. This indicates that we need new and innovative methods for assistance, protection, and solutions, and we need them urgently, now more than ever. As a normative legal system, the refugee regime works to maintain minimum standards for those facing forced displacement, as detailed in the 1951 Refugee Convention and its protocol. But without any advisory or enforcement mechanism, the behaviors of some of the most powerful actors are only policed by political will, placing refugees themselves at the whim of power brokers. This regime consistently views refugees as recipients of aid, as passive actors without a stake in the decisions being made on their behalf. Those facing forced displacement are stripped of their political rights and instead endowed with solely legal rights, leaving them in the position of clientized recipients. Shifting our thinking to viewing refugees as active agents, uniquely affected by both the political and legal realities, is a first and fundamental step towards offering refugees full humanity. Because we live or we have lived through them, refugees are far more aware of the shortcomings of the legal systems we find ourselves in and the durable solutions designed to protect us and other segments of the global refugee response system for addressing these issues far better than anyone else. Our lives are impacted by the flaws in the system on a daily basis. Our lived experiences and insights are therefore invaluable in identifying and addressing the problems. Refugee participation in policymaking can help transform the global refugee system. It can help it become more equitable, more effective, more responsive, and importantly, more legitimate. Together, we need to reimagine a system where refugees have a seat at the table and can add our expertise and lived experiences to a system that we depend on for protection and one that we know inside and out. To effectively address the complex challenges faced by millions of displaced individuals, we require a robust, evidence-based approach, and importantly, the input of those with lived experiences of displacement for the development of policies and programming that are closer to the reality and the needs on the ground. Participation begets solutions. Many programs aimed at helping refugees are limited to humanitarian aid, and they continue to fail because they do not tackle the underlying causes of displacement. And they will keep failing because humanitarian solutions are no longer sufficient on their own. Development and peace-building actors are also required to address the root causes and consequences of forced displacement. And of course, refugees need to be at the forefront of solutions. The international aid system must evolve from seeing survivors only as passive victims to one that empowers them as change agents. To truly transform the global refugee system, we must reimagine a system where we actively participate and influence the policies and programs that affect our lives. We are in a period marked by democratic backslide, rising populism, and funding shortages. To combat these, the global refugee regime must be reinvigorated by bold approaches centering refugees within its planning, design, and implementation. This year alone, we have seen new cases of climate-induced displacement, an increase in flows through dangerous routes, such as the one through the Darien Gap, and escalating conflict, which sees no potential end anytime soon. We must act decisively to prevent further suffering. And we do not need a new list of recommendations. We know what we need to do, but we need increased political will to address the root causes of displacement. But we cannot wait around for our political leaders to do the right thing. So each one of us must step up and act now with courage, commitment, and impact in mind. I encourage all of you in the room to find ways to support the refugee leadership ecosystems that are in your domestic settings, as they often act as the first responders on the ground, doing the most difficult jobs with the least amount of financing. By harnessing the transformative power of inclusion and amplifying the voices of refugees, we can pave the way for policies and initiatives that foster stronger, more resilient communities. Let us work together to build societies where the talents of all people are recognized and all of our potential is maximized, and where the strength of diversity becomes the cornerstone of our collective progress. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have a Māori proverb, which I believe is truly apt for the situation and the challenges that we face today. He aha te mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is the people, it is the people, it is the people. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. I look forward to discussing these issues in further detail alongside my esteemed co-panelists. Thank you very much.
Quite literally, no better way to frame the complexity of this topic. I just want to thank you. I think I have been in many rooms, like most of you probably, where the personal, the professional, the political are all swimming together. And I think as a former refugee, I just recognize the personal struggles and the thriving and the enduring that you must be doing, enough to also help the sector evolve and become better. So thank you for that kind of leadership. Another round of applause. I want to introduce briefly my colleagues who will be joining me for a discussion following that. Dana, Ahilan, and John. I don't know how we follow it, but we're going to try. We're going to try. I'd love to join. If you could join me here at the front of the room. John Prendergast, Aurora Prize Selection Committee member and co-founder of The Century. Dana Graber Ladek, Chief of Mission, IOM Mexico. Thank you so much. And Ahilan Arulanantham. I hope I did you right, but if not, you can correct me. UCLA law professor from Pratt and co-director of the UCLA Law Center for Immigration, Law, and Policy. Rez, would you mind also joining us, please? This is a room full of experts, practitioners, donors, doers, but as I tee up Dana for what she's seeing in her arena in Mexico, I wonder, maybe just an engagement exercise, how many of you have lived experience in displacement? Raise your hand, please. Raise them high. We recognize you and we welcome you and we appreciate you. How many of you have ever supported, lived next to, went to school with, worked with those who have lived experience? We love that. Hello, raise, excellent. How many of you have in your work, in your line of work, been affected so deeply, even if you've not been displaced, but you know what it's like to struggle, and you know what it's like to be resilient, and you know what it's like to start over in a new home? That's nearly everyone. We're all bonded by this, and we will be liberated by this. Dana, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, one, what brings you personally to this work? And maybe part of that, what are you seeing in Mexico around the flows, the immigration, the dangerous paths that our communities, our brothers and sisters in the world are having to go through?
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here and to be part of this amazing forum. I've been very inspired throughout the day. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, so maybe while that's being queued, I can just talk a little bit about what brought me to this line of work. Recently, out of undergrad, I started volunteering, and I volunteered with Peace Corps and I volunteered with the AmeriCorps, worked in the United States with people who were homeless, and then worked in Central America with migrants, and that's really what started my career. And I now have been with IOM for 20 years, 6 different countries, 3 kids, each one born in a separate country. So I feel very much part of the international community. For us as part of the UN Migration Agency, so we are IOM, and just the World Migration Report was just released this week, where we cite quite a few different statistics in terms of refugees, migrants, internally displaced people. For us, internally displaced people is a broader term that is part of the movement of people, part of migration. IOM's definition of migration includes people who have left their normal position of residence to cross borders or to move within their country. And so this would include internally displaced people. We have some very interesting statistics in terms of the current statistic is that there's 117 million people who are either internally displaced, refugees, or asylum seekers in the world. And so for us, our focus as the UN Migration Agency is internally displaced people. These, because we have, of course, UNHCR, whose mandate is refugees, and there isn't any particular UN agency that has their mandate only for displaced people. And so this is obviously an important area where we work. And so for displaced people, the distinguishing factor is that they had to leave their homes. They were forced to leave their homes because of general violence, because of armed conflict, or because of insecurity. And so what we're seeing, and Rez brought this up through her presentation, was really important, is the role that climate change and disasters is now playing on this. So my next slide, a map of Central America and Mexico, and this is where it demonstrates the flows and the danger zones of where people are moving. And one important point to recognize is that when we're talking about migration flows, they're really human mobility. So it's sometimes hard to tease out whether somebody is fleeing from their home, whether they're leaving for economic reasons, because all of it is so closely tied together. But the underlying factor is that people are looking for a better way of life. They're looking for security. They're looking for stability for themselves and for their family. And so in this map where you see the various flows, this is where we've got migration flows that are also joined by internally displaced people, especially in Mexico. Rez mentioned the Darien in Panama, the Darien and Mexico, and several locations in Mexico are considered the most dangerous when it comes to displacement. And so what we're seeing also in these routes, these very dangerous routes, that it's of course not just unique to the Americas, but this is where I'm based, so I will focus on that, is that there's a very concentrated criminal network that is very closely linked to either displacing these people in the first place or moving them through smuggling. And then, of course, trafficking is closely linked to this. And so I'm sure you all have heard in the news also in terms of the many different types of abuses, which whether they're gender or sexual abuses, whether it's extortion, whether it's kidnapping, that these individuals who've already experienced very traumatizing backgrounds and contexts are then going through this as they move. And so in terms of what IOM's doing, we have a strategy that we just launched in our strategic plan that goes from 2024 to 2028, has three main priorities. The first one is saving lives. The second one is identifying solutions for displacement. And the third one is promoting regular pathways for people in mobility. And really all three of these are linked. So you can tell that for IOM at a global level, this is extremely important for us to find local level solutions, policy and planning, data, partnerships, et cetera. Going back to globally, if we want to narrow down in terms of what are the statistics for internally displaced people, just in 2022, and that really is the most recent accurate figures as all of the data is consolidated. So according to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, almost 61 million people were displaced in that one single year in 2022. And if we look at these statistics, and so people are displaced, and in ideal circumstances, they do return back to their homes. And this is especially the case with disasters. But in terms of protracted displacement, in 2022, it was 71.1 million people. From 2023, where it was only 33.1 million, 2013 to 2022, 33 million to 71 million in 110 countries. And the top 5 countries of displacement: Syria, Ukraine, Democratic Republic of Congo, and it was such an honor to have to listen to Dr. Mikuwe speak this morning, Colombia and Yemen as the top 5 countries. So I want to take a little deeper dive before I wrap it up, and that's to talk specifically about Mexico. According to IDMC, there's almost 400,000 people that have been displaced in Mexico, but we know that this is underestimated because there isn't any type of registration system. Even the definition of internally displaced people is not clear. But the positive aspect is in that 2019, the Mexican government recognized that displacement was a problem, which was a huge advancement, that we could actually talk about displacement being a problem in Mexico. And so there are tremendous challenges that we're seeing. Not least of those, as I mentioned, no registration, no clear definition, no real idea of how to address this, no federal framework in terms of migration and displacement and what can be done in terms of displaced people. And then natural disasters, again, climate change, that was so important in the opening remarks. And if we look at Hurricane Otis, that over a few hours developed from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane, where 23,000 people were displaced. And the World Bank estimates that in Mexico, between 1.7 and 8 million people by 2050 will be displaced to cities. So having a tremendous impact on cities in Mexico. And so IOM, we're doing a lot of work in this space and globally, as I mentioned, but especially in Mexico when it comes to gathering data on this, trying to build resilience in these communities that are displaced, doing direct assistance, helping with legislation, giving tools to people, to the government so they can better address these problems, adaptation, direct assistance. All of this is tremendously important, but we still have so many challenges when it comes to displacement in this region, and especially in Mexico, that has such a high number of people being internally displaced. And that is that in studies that we have done, we did one in 12 cities on the US-Mexico border, more and more shelters are being filled up with internally displaced people instead of just international migrants. And for these people, so we did some surveys with them, and 95% said that they were displaced because of violence or because of missing person family members. So disappearances in Mexico is a huge thing, and it is directly related to internal displacement. And 95% of these individuals that we interviewed said that they wanted to move to the United States. So I'll end it with
Maybe if
that.
we can- thank you.
And the need for successful solutions. Thank
I
you.
love it. Thank you so much. I know it's not a topic. Absolutely. Because of its changing nature, it's not a topic that we can just do 10 minutes on. So I think definitely we'll share the slides and you have access to Dana while she's here. So hopefully we can continue that. You and Rez both covered the sort of political aspect of it diplomatically, but nevertheless, the creators of displaced communities or the reasons why people are displaced. And you mentioned the numbers around how many millions of people are on the move. John, I want to come to you because you've done as much work on understanding those conditions, but as well as maybe sometimes the invisible networks, the stakeholders, the actors who are, as you say, orchestrators, perpetrators, the people who at the source are some of the reasons why people are in these horrible conditions. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, but perhaps leading into it, a little bit of why, John, you have been working in this sector for a long time.
Well, thanks, Nasra. My new BFF, if you don't mind.
100%.
I hope everybody gets the chance to find their BFF at the Aurora. That's one of the many things that New Bar has created here. I'm from a family of Irish storytellers, so I got to use notes. Otherwise, I'll be here talking till the gala, and I'll by myself because we'll be like, when is this guy going to stop?
I'll be here. Don't worry.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, and what I want to talk about briefly is really a through line from what Dr. Mukwege was saying, and what fundamentally undergirded his comments. Is in most cases, there are specific officials in governments and their international collaborators who are deciding to pursue strategies of forced displacement. They can escalate to ethnic cleansing, as you all know, and sometimes even to genocide. So when Nagorno-Karabakh was ethnically cleansed last year, not one Azerbaijani official has faced any kind of repercussion, any kind of consequence, whether diplomatic, legal, or financial. It's extraordinary. In Sudan, there's a warlord that many of you know, follow the news, named General Hemeti, who has undertaken genocidal campaigns in Darfur, again, 20 years after the genocide that many of us all knew of in the early 2000s, in mid-2000s. And he's undertaken that again in Darfur and elsewhere in the country. Again, no consequence. Despite now, for 2023-24, the highest displacement rate in the world in Sudan, in large part due to the actions that have been taken very consciously to displace people as the war strategy. So around the globe, the government responses to this kind of these forced displacement campaigns are very politicized. We all know this. It's unsurprising that geopolitics drive the response to these kinds of things. Strategic calculations are much more important than the protection of human life, and that's just a reality. Everyone in this room is aware, and Dr. Mukwege hammered this home today, everyone is of the disparities in the response to a place like Ukraine, even though it's woefully inadequate, but you compare that to a place like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So that's the reality of our world's priorities, and it has always been so, I believe. The question is, what can we do about that within the confines of these geopolitical priorities? And I don't know if we're so far behind that I have time to do that. What do you think, Nasra?
I think you should go for it.
Should I go for it? Okay. Thank you, because otherwise I'm just depressing people. The next step beyond what Dr. Mukwege was talking about, he was talking largely about, make some level of reverse impunity through legal accountability. As all of you know, that often takes years, decades, and it's often very few people who face actual consequences in the international legal mechanisms or domestic legal mechanisms. But a really underutilized policy tool in response to forced displacement and horrible human rights abuses is financial accountability. Almost always, there are officials and companies and their facilitators and enablers in the international system who profit from forced displacement strategies. Billions and billions of dollars are siphoned, sucked out of these places while people's lives are being, communities, regions, countries are being destroyed. The orchestrators and the beneficiaries of forced displacement are usually deeply connected to the international financial system and are almost always laundering the proceeds of their human rights crimes through international global banks, through real estate, through companies. Therein lies their vulnerability. Rather than, so what we usually do in these places is we sanction an individual in their own name. Now, they never do business in their, almost never do business in their own name. It's useless. And so then everybody says, well, sanctions are ineffective because we don't learn the lessons that we should be imposing sanctions on the entire networks of facilitators and companies and other beneficiaries, the war profiteers, the system of war profiteering that surrounds those that are orchestrating forced displacement, and then enforce those sanctions and multilateralize them. And not only that, use the extraordinary array of anti-money laundering measures and tools that rose up in the aftermath of 9/11 in response to counterterrorism imperatives that can be used and have been used for other purposes. Why not human rights? Why not forced displacement? They are occasionally used, and they're amazingly effective in creating a consequence for these kinds of atrocities and crimes. Make those responsible for forced displacement pay a price for their actions. It's a very simple message. Remember, within forcible displacement campaigns, there are massive sexual and gender-based violence campaigns, very, very overt and directed by the top. There's the use of food and starvation as a weapon of war. I could go on and on with all the different tactics, all of them war crimes and crimes against humanity, all of them sanctionable offenses. Pick your poison, use those as the rationale for the imposition of some kind of financial consequence. So this creates, in addition to creating a consequence, it also creates some measure of deterrence, perhaps, in some places. And without any deterrence, why would it end? This morning, Nick Kristof wrote a piece, kind of a good one for the end of today, for all of us to read, because he, as he always does every year, he does one piece. 99% of his pieces are, oh God, the terrible things are happening. Then he does one piece like, hey, here's why I'm looking forward to the future of the world, and there's great things happening out here. And he goes through all the, the advances that have happened over the last 100 years and all that stuff. But then he said something very interesting. He said, I'm not, even though I've said all this positive stuff, I'm not an optimist, I'm a realist. But he said, I'm also he called it a possibilist. And when you see this, a possibilist, I love that. I mean, what we're talking about today and the kind of measures that it doesn't guarantee that we're going to turn things around, but it makes a better future more possible. We need to, I think, show that the communities that have been forcibly displaced, that there is some measure of justice available. They don't have to wait 30, 40 years to see somebody potentially in the dock, one person or two person in the Hague, but rather there's things that can happen right now in response to this, and that these people have not been forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm glad we extended it to that. I think that's incredibly important. And I'll pick up a couple of things around the response part with Ahilan, but I just want to say, since we're quoting and we've all been moved by so many of the morning speakers, but I did write down the 5 recommendations that Dr. Dennis McCouey did recommend for all of us to take it seriously. And I think the fact that he said, one, it starts with prevention. And I know he meant a particular community, but prevention really as a standard. But we don't want to just keep responding. We ought to do some things big and ambitious to respond in a way where we're preventing. But second to that, he said, we also have to respond to people. And part of responding to folks and responding to those who have come under such atrocities is accountability. And accountability is healing. I thought that was quite powerful. On the response side, from maybe less international and more domestic side, Ahilan, I'd love to come to you and ask you, what are the responses that you're seeing here in the US? And caveat, I mean, the US only takes in so few communities from around the world, but we know the majority of displaced communities are hosted in the global south outside of the countries that we sometimes call home. But Ahilan, what are you seeing there? And how do you assess the response?
One thing I will say first, actually, thank you very much to the Promise Institute and to Aurora for inviting me and for putting all this on. But two things I want to say before I start. The first is that I'm from born here, but I'm also from a refugee community. My family is Sri Lankan Tamil, and my parents left Sri Lanka shortly before the civil war broke out. Because of violence, sporadic violence, and race discrimination against my community, the Tamil community in Northeast Sri Lanka. And hearing you, John, talk about waiting, the war in Sri Lanka ended in 2009. There were 70,000 people killed in less than 6 months. There have been a number of scholars who have looked at it and said they believe it's at least strong evidence of genocide in that conflict. There's 17,000 people killed in 2 weeks in the last months of that conflict. The UN recommended trial process essentially to look into crimes against humanity, and there's been nothing. There's been no accountability of any kind for that conflict. And so when you talk about that, particularly when the then defense minister of Sri Lanka was actually a US citizen, a dual citizen, but a US citizen, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, it's definitely something on my mind. 15 years will be May 18th, this coming 18th. The other thing I wanted to say, by the way, before I get into it, I'm a professor at this law school, the law school at UCLA. And I've been distracted by what's been happening here. So it certainly won't be the focus of what I want to say, but I must say that I've had students who were legal observing the protests. I had students who were in the encampment. There was a person working for our Center for Immigration Law and Policy who was a student journalist, all of whom were attacked by either this mob of people who came to challenge the encampment that was set up, or then by the police who the university called in to mass arrest a bunch of people with rubber bullets and all this before they cleared the encampment. Whatever you think of the conflict, which is I know a complex question. For me, it's difficult to represent the university, which I do, I proudly do, and I love this university, but it's difficult to do it on a day, just after a week like this, where the university has suppressed its students for peaceful protests. So I just wanted to say that before I continue. So yes, to go to your question, the Biden administration and in this present moment really has taken a fascinating approach, in some ways very problematic from a human rights perspective, but in other ways also very innovative from a human rights perspective when it comes to humanitarian admissions into the US and asylum policy. And I think this reflects the sort of political movements of what's happening in the country more generally. And there's a sort of narrative of chaos at the border associated with what I think of as the kind of core protection of the Refugee Convention, which is that if a person comes to the shores of a country and requests asylum or says that they fear persecution, fear return, the government is obligated to consider that claim and to take them in pending the determination of that claim. And although, as you say, the number of people displaced who come to the US is a tiny fraction of the number of people who are displaced all over the world, it is still nonetheless true that that number has been very large during the last several years in terms of like historical terms as for the southwest border of the US. So, depending on how you talk, it might not be the very largest it's been, but it's a lot of people who have come. And of course, it's very good politics in this country in certain sectors to sort of describe this as chaotic. And there's no question that it has imposed significant short-term humanitarian burdens on local governments and state governments that have had to take in a large number of people in a very short period of time, and particularly Venezuelans. A huge chunk of the number of people that we're talking about have been from Venezuela. So, a couple of different things that the Biden administration has done. One thing that it has done is it has really sort of continued in somewhat modified fashion a lot of the attacks on the asylum system that the Trump administration ran. And I won't get into those in a lot of detail, but they have tried, for example, to make arguments about why people who are transiting through other countries cannot seek asylum in the United States, tried to argue that you cannot seek asylum in the United States if you cross in the desert rather than coming through a port of entry, which perhaps wouldn't be a big deal if they weren't also stopping people from applying for asylum in ports of entry, but the combination of those things has the effect of making it very difficult. That's sort of one set of things, and I, as a human rights person, certainly oppose those. Simultaneously, the administration has also expanded the power of something called parole. And parole is a very vague general term in our law, but essentially it's like the government has the power to let somebody come here, either let them in at the border or let them come from abroad, regardless of whether or not they otherwise would have a right to live here, for humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. That's what the statute says. Urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. Very general. And that's authority that the government has used and presidents have used going back for decades to let in something like 56,000, if I remember right, Hungarians in 1956. Lots and lots of people from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in the 70s. Cubans, I mean, lots of people. I won't even try to cover them all. The government has had this authority to bring people here. And the Biden administration has used that power to do a lot of interesting things. Obviously, all of you will remember that the United States military pulled out of Afghanistan in August of 2021. Oh, thank you so much. And at that time, when the US pulled out, there were about 90,000-ish people. It's a huge number of people who actually came on planes as the pullout was happening, in the days before and like on the last day as Kabul was falling, came out. And those people were all let into the country on parole. So that power that I mentioned a second ago, right? But even apart from that, then there was a program called Allies Welcome that the US set up to allow people from Afghanistan to come into the United States to seek parole. But that program did not run very well. That's actually a real understatement. It was really kind of horrific for a whole variety of reasons. There was so there are a couple of different things I want to say about it, but the bottom line, if you go all the way to the bottom of the slide, something like 123 total people, the actual 100, not 120,000, 123 people out of something like 60,000 people who applied were able to come to the United States under that program. So it's almost no one, and then they shut the program down. To qualify, you had to pay a fee, you had to submit an application on paper. I mean, these things are very mundane things, but these really matter, right? It makes it really, really hard to apply. You had to show that you were specifically being targeted by the Taliban. And there were lots and lots of delays in that process. Lots of applications just sat there with nothing happening to them. A few months after that, February 2022, so it's really a short time, right? Russia invades Ukraine. And there is a huge amount of political mobilization to support Ukrainian refugees, which was fantastic. And I absolutely support that. I believe those people should all have the right to go wherever they can to flee the violence in Ukraine. And the administration stood up really one of the most spectacular parole policies in the history of the United States, period. It's an incredible program. They set up a system where any person, a private sponsor, like practically anyone, like people in this room, could just say they want to sponsor a person from Ukraine. It wasn't just for a single person. You could sponsor a family. You could apply on the internet. So it did not require this fee that you had to send a paper to the Department of State. There was no requirement of harm beyond just a sort of generalized showing the war in Ukraine is obviously harming lots of people. That was sufficient. No particular showing of targeting required. And they were processed. These applications were processed in 6 to 8 weeks. As of the time I did the slide, which is now outdated, this is a slide I believe is from late 2022, if I remember right, about 68,000 of the 88,000 applications had been granted. As of something like spring of 23, about a year ago, something like a total of 270,000 people from Ukraine had come into the United States. And that number is growing and growing because the program is still running. People are coming here through private sponsorships. They're getting employment authorizations very quickly. And it's extraordinary. And it's been incredible what has been done to protect those people. That being said, this disparity is crazy, right? If you look at these two things, like there is no reason why you shouldn't be able to have all these simple, like apply through the internet, don't have a fee, sponsor a whole family so that they don't get separated apart. All these things obviously could run for other countries too, including Afghanistan. So the administration never ran it for Afghanistan, but they faced a huge amount of withering criticism from people, including me and other people from my center, saying, hey, this is really discriminatory. It's not right for you to be doing this for Ukrainians and not for others. It really looks like race discrimination. It's very hard to understand like what else is going on here. Obviously, geopolitics and race are complicated. So yeah, it worked. Although they did not end up running a program for Afghanistan, some months after that, for Venezuela, kind of at the end of 2022, and then early in January 2023, for the other countries, they set up a similar program like the one for Ukrainians for Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. It's called the CHNV program. And it has many of the features of the Ukraine program. The one big difference, and you think about those countries like Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, these are Western Hemisphere countries having major humanitarian crises. One thing about these countries, of course, is there's lots of people coming here, including to the border from those countries, producing the chaos that has become a political problem for the Biden administration. And under the program, you can apply through a sponsor. So anyone, a church, a family member, an employer, any person who just vouches for you, basically says like, hey, I will support these people. And I say support, but they have employment authorization. So it's not like, it sort of requires a massive financial commitment, but I will support these people if they come here and they're allowed to live here for 2 years. They get work authorization very quickly. That 2 years can be renewed. And this program has been just remarkably successful. And of course, you fly. You have to take a plane. So you fly here. You have to apply from abroad, which means you don't come to the border. And the effect of the program has been extraordinary. 30,000 people a month, a total from these countries have been coming. That number is capped under the program. So one big difference that makes this program not quite as good as the Ukraine program, not as good by a long shot, is the Ukraine program has no cap. So there's no numerical limitation. This one does. A total of 30,000 people per month can come, but that's still a huge number of people. And then the last slide I'll show you, you can see this, well, it doesn't really work that well this way, but the number of people on this slide, there's about 10-ish thousand people per country gap. The number of people who have arrived versus the number of people going the wrong direction, who are vetted. And the reason for that is because that cap has created a backlog now. One of the things that we'd really like to see is the Biden administration lift that backlog, lift that cap, and treat the program truly like the Ukraine program is treated. The very last thing I'll say, which maybe we can get into in Q&A, the state of Texas and a number of other Republican states sued this program. They didn't sue the Ukraine program, but they sued this program and said it was unlawful for reasons that I will not bore you with. And my center, the attorneys here at UCLA, the Center for Immigration Law and Policy, along with some other organizations, intervened to represent people, sponsoring people coming from these countries to defend the legality of the program and to tell their stories to the court. This is a court in the Southern District of Texas. And we went to trial actually in August, put on witnesses to say, and these are, by the way, people across the ideological spectrum, Republicans, people from the Peace Corps who knew their friends, family members, all kinds of people. And we actually won, which was shocking in front of this court in Texas. And so that's something really interesting the Biden administration is doing. And I'm sure we'll have more to say when we go into the next stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think, this is a kind of a tee up for all of you. We'll have about 5 minutes. I know we started late, but we want to make sure you get to the other sessions as well. But I'm intrigued by the variety of different responses. And I think it's really helpful for any discussion to be both honest and truthful and a little challenging as well, because not all responses are equal, no matter how much we want them to be. Rez, you said something so powerful and so beautiful about participatory, meaningful inclusion begets solution. I just want to know more about that. I wonder if you have seen examples, behaviors that we could all walk away with that really helps us get to the challenge of being inclusive, which we're not there yet.
Yeah, I think there are many examples to highlight here. At the heart of what I was saying is that those who are impacted directly and face the challenges on a daily basis know exactly what the challenges are. And then also what kind of solutions work. We're already seeing a lot of investment, billions and billions of dollars in the refugee sector towards programming and policies. And oftentimes there are obviously good policies and good programs that do work, but a lot of them aren't working. And we're investing so much money into them. It just makes sense for everybody involved if people who are going to be at the back end of those programs and policies have a say on why they're not working and what could be improved. And not just through consultations, but actually through the entire design process, understanding what the issues are from the beginning, what kind of challenges they're facing, what they need to address them, and then being involved in the planning, the design, the implementation, and then afterwards in the evaluation to say, how could it be improved? One remarkable example in the New Zealand context that I've seen firsthand and been involved with communities in New Zealand was that under our previous government, not the Labour government, the national government, and now we're back into a national government now, which is our centre right. But under that previous government, there was a discriminatory policy in the resettlement program, which discriminated against refugees from North Africa, Middle East regions, and that we're seeing less resettlement from those particular countries because of this particular strategy. And a whole group of refugees and people with lived experience of forced displacement challenged the government on this to say that it was discriminatory and that we shouldn't be resettling refugees just from Latin America or the Asia region, but actually increasing the numbers from North Africa and Middle East as well. It was essentially what we were calling a Muslim ban, because it was just directly those countries that were limited. And because of this powerful advocacy by refugee communities and challenging the government, we were able to get that policy removed. And now there is equal strategy across the refugee resettlement sector for all groups, regardless of which countries they're coming from. And that, I think, is a powerful example of what happens when refugees are talking about exactly what they need to address the challenges and then being involved in the kind of policies that they want to see to fix the challenges.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I've just been given the sign that we may not have much time for Q&A, but you know what? Remember a couple of days ago when Armin Afian, our executive director for Aurora, said, get close, get curious, connect with people. This is my invitation to you to hold on to your question. You'll have access to these colleagues over the next hours, maybe day as well, but please do share your question. I'm sorry we don't have a Q&A. We want to let the rest of the other sessions start, but thank you so much to the panelists.